I've gotten a 1488 comment in response to one of my videos, so I looked up what 1488 meant, and I decided it was an example of self-directed racism. Then I went looking around for definitions of what racism was to see if I could find any examples of this self-directed form, and I found nothing. I found one mention of it in searching the internet, which was people trying to find an example and not quite doing so. And I was really quite struck by this absence in the dictionary of any mention of a particular form of prejudice, which can more accurately be described, more generally described, as collectivism. This is the belief that the collective is more important and superior to the individual, of which the individual that's a member of that collective. And yet, of course, this is not something people think of as a prejudice. If you think of somebody who's you don't like, you don't say, "Oh, that person is so collectivist." This doesn't come up at all, and it's remarkably absent. And this sort of omission is so widespread in something as fundamental as the way we classify all living things that it's really quite shocking. We're often told in nature programs that the mission in life of a living thing is to perpetuate its species. And that's a way of saying the species is more important than the individual. Now, species are defined in a particular and prejudiced, I would say, to some degree, way, because they are defined in a way that does not include all living things, or even all living things at all times in their lives. The definition of a species is something you could get quite different responses to if you went up to somebody, particularly in something like a singles bar, and said first, "Are we members of the same species?" And then later, say you're doing speed dating and you try a different version of the same question, you could say, "Are we actually or potentially interbreeding?" You could get quite different answers from the two if you're dealing with a human being. With an animal or plant, it might not be so. You simply put the two, the males and the females, together in breeding season under the right conditions, and they'll breed pretty much automatically. With people, they might want to play a video game, they might be busy, they might not show up and say, "Oh, my species card, I meant to go there." It'd be like working out at the gym or something. "I meant to go exercise my membership, but I forgot to, I was busy." That other thing's going on. So membership in one species is not the same for a human as it is for an animal. And someone who's actually or potentially interbreeding can let that membership lapse as a human. Even if they're fertile, they might not be exercising the ability at a particular time. They might not be interested. And they're not actually or potentially interbreeding in the short term for large chunks of their lives. Some people might be too old, too young, of the wrong orientation, or any number of other things. And once you stop exercising your membership in that way, you're no longer, according to the definition, a member of your species or a member of your race. In the movie Children of Men, there's an interesting proposition which is raised and then never explored. What would happen if everybody in the world became infertile at once? They never mention this. There's still racism in that world, which I would submit doesn't make a lot of sense, because if that happened, there would be no races. There'd be no species. These are categories. They are classifications that apply to populations that can interbreed. You lose the ability to interbreed, your race and your species are done. They cease to exist at that moment. It's not accurate to say that one surviving animal that's the last of its former population is the last of its species, because the species at that point has already ceased to exist. It hasn't died, because a species is not, strictly speaking, a living thing, just a category we use to classify things with. But individuals can outlive the species they were once part of, and this is extremely important in the way we organize other collectives. Collectivism has the excuse for its existence and its prejudicial way of looking at people and things, because the collective is assumed to outlast the individual, to be eternal or invulnerable in some way. And yet, if everybody made up their minds on a given day to say, I'm not going to take part. I'm not going to be part of my race today. I'm not going to be part of my species today. Be gone. Race and species would be gone, popped like a soap bubble. So this self-directed form, the idea that one's race is more important than one's self, and that one should devote one's energies to perpetuating one's race, I would say, is a form of prejudice, quite deadly, directed against oneself. The way that we could preserve diversity of people without destroying individual people would be to clone them, to refresh their cells so that one individual reproduces asexually more efficiently. We already do it all the time. We're always making new cells to replace the ones that died. But if we could keep people younger longer, then they would have an incredibly larger choice of sexual partners. If everybody was essentially the same biological age, you'd have vastly more people to choose from. But people probably wouldn't exercise that choice nearly as often. They wouldn't be in as much of a hurry, and they wouldn't have any immediate need to keep the population up. So at that point, we would not have what has commonly been described, well, been described by some as a new species if people didn't age. It would be the end of a species. At least we would function as a species for only a small proportion of our time, a lifetime's the time when we decided to mix genes with somebody else. A species that clones itself does not meet the definition of a species because it is not mixing genes between its members. So those species that reproduce by cloning, those populations of individuals that reproduce that way do not meet the definition, are no longer species. And some of individuals who normally sexually produce, if they're made to be cloned, are not meeting the definition either. And this has profound implications for the way we position ourselves with regard to collectives in our world.